thank you to Peggy and thank you to Gleaves Whitney particularly for inviting me this evening. Let me get a quick glass of water here. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight. I can't tell you how impressed I am with the Hauenstein Center. I was telling Gleaves earlier that I have never seen a center like this at any other university. And so I, on behalf of universities everywhere, would like to say thank you for having a center like this and for supporting it so strongly, because the work that you do in developing students is absolutely crucial. And as someone who cares about moral education, it is of course very near and dear to my heart. So thank you all for having this center and for being involved in the community and for coming here this evening. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about civility. I know it's kind of an odd thing to be excited about, but when we think about civility, we often think of something like this, right? But of course, the very notion of this has nothing to do with civility. This is the kind of sort of background objective you have when you want to stab someone in the back, this manipulative attitude. And notice not only is that not civil, it's not polite, and that kind of manipulative approach is downright unethical. So clearly that's not what we're interested in talking about. So what is civility? Well, I'm going to look at several different things throughout the talk. We're going to start by looking at what civility is not. I'm going to talk a bit about John Stuart Mill's marketplace of ideas. I'm going to look at how civility plays a role in the context of education. And then I'm going to turn the tables a bit, and we're going to look at what happens in civility in just regular civic life outside of education itself, and then look at some problems there, and then wrap up with some prescriptions for what we can do to develop civility. So let's get started. So a quote of mine I really like. People often think, again, that politeness is the art of choosing among one's real thoughts, right? So here you're not stabbing someone in the back, but you clearly have more than one idea in mind, and you're selecting from among them. Well, civility is not politeness. Civility is not formal politeness and courtesy in behavior or speech. Civility is not about restricting ideas either. If anything, it's about promoting ideas and exploring ideas. We'll talk about that and why. It is certainly not restricting free speech, and there's been lots of charges lately that this is what civility really is. It's about simply restricting free speech and limiting what can be said. Civility is also not about restricting interactions. So we commonly think you shouldn't talk about politics at dinner, or you shouldn't talk about politics in mixed company. And that's not the goal of civility either. Civility is not about minimizing our interactions. It's not about minimizing what we say. And it's certainly not about policing our own thoughts. So John Stuart Mill was the most famous proponent of a position that's come to be known as the marketplace of ideas, although Mill never used that term. So he's a famous British philosopher. He was a utilitarian. He was very famous for lots of reasons, but we're going to be looking tonight at some of his writings in a classic text titled On Liberty, which was written in 1859. And one of the things that Mill said is that whatever people believe on subjects of which it is the first importance to believe rightly, they ought to be able to defend at least the common objections. If the cultivation of the understanding consists in one thing more than another, it is surely in learning the grounds of one's own opinions. But when we think about the marketplace of ideas, we commonly think of an individual consumer in a huge grocery store who is free to select from among a huge array of ideas, and it's this simple act of selection, right? You take one thing rather than another based on mere preference. That's not really the kind of idea that Mill was after here. He was interested in facts and evidence and the selection of ideas based on the evaluation of them in light of facts and evidence. So that's really the first key or core idea as part of the marketplace of ideas. But he also notes that wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, but facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. And so this brings us to a second core or key aspect of Mill's notion of the marketplace of ideas, which is that we then can look and think not just about the individual evaluating ideas, but as looking at two different options or several options and looking at the benefits or the demerits of each one and choosing between them. But again, we often have this assumption that we're an individual lone thinker selecting between these ideas and evaluating facts and evidence on our own. And that's not at all the idea that Mill had in mind. For Mill, now hopefully you have real engagement with others. This is a famous statue in London. It's FDR and Churchill called The Conversation. So I loved this. So hopefully you have real engagement with others. But for Mill, this was crucial, that in order for us to actually engage and evaluate and use facts and evidence rightly, we had to have discussion. And so he notes, he is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. And so a huge part of this for Mill, probably the most essential part of this for Mill, is the role of engagement. The idea of a single lone thinker selecting between ideas and engaging and evaluating them via facts and reason is simply not enough. And so the steady habit of correcting and completing his own opinion by collating it with those of others, so far from causing doubt and hesitation in carrying it into practice, is the only stable foundation in just reliance on it. For being cognizant of all that can be said against him, knowing that he has sought for objections and difficulties and has shut out no light which can be thrown upon the subject, he has a right to think his judgment better than that of any person or any multitude who have not gone through a similar process. So for Mill, not only then is it discussion, but it's discussion of a certain type. It's a discussion that engages in a process where ideas are evaluated in concert with others so that you can then interpret the facts and evidence. So a crucial point of Mill, beyond just engagement, is actually evaluating and using rules of logic, and Mill is quite serious about this. He doesn't just mean we should engage in conversation. He doesn't just mean that we should evaluate facts and evidence. He means that our judgments must be restricted by logic itself. So despite whatever we want to believe, 2 + 2 simply isn't 5, right? No matter how much we might want to believe it, that's just flat out simply wrong. So he notes, no one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. The truth gains more even by the errors of one who with due study and preparation thinks for himself than by the true opinions of those who only hold them because they do not suffer themselves to think. He means this quite seriously. It doesn't matter what our starting position is on this road, we've got to follow that road to wherever the conclusion is and wherever the end of the road lies. The whole strength and value, then, of human judgment, depending on the one property, that it can be set right when it is wrong. Reliance can be placed upon it only when the means of setting it right are kept constantly at hand. So what are those means? Well, for Mill, their use of facts and evidence, their engagement and discussion with others, and their strict adherence to logic. So it's the critical examination of those ideas in concert with others that are the means of setting our beliefs and facts constantly at hand. So what this means then essentially for Mill is informed and engaged disagreement and criticism is not civility. And notice this is really key. Informed and engaged disagreement is not incivility. So regardless of your political views, this political cartoon captures the essence of what we're thinking of when we think about a civil disagreement. So I know it might be difficult to read. The fellow on the left says, all we're saying is that it's high time we reevaluate the validity of this all or nothing interpretation of the Second Amendment. And the fellow from the gun lobby says, hey, let's keep it civil over there, hippie. Right. So notice this is a classic example of how one party is interested in engaging in a conversation, evaluating the concept of the Second Amendment, while the second party is not. Now, civility then has an essential role in aiding our discourse. It gives us primarily shared standards and expectations for a number of crucial things that are important for basic democratic process. Attitudes, behavior, argumentation, evidence, and reasoning. Without those, we can't have any kind of discussion at all. So for Mill, the concept of the marketplace of ideas, it not only assumes these conditions for what civil disagreement is, so that in order to have civil disagreement at all, these must be the case. But notice it also requires that they are already in place in order to have disagreement. So participants must have the willingness to weigh ideas by facts and evidence. Participants must have an interest in constructive engagement. And participants must have respect for the rules of reasoning. And we could see these as being the three key ideas as part of the Mill's marketplace of ideas. And this really encapsulates the reasons why Mill cares about this so much. Not that it is solely or chiefly to form great thinkers that freedom of thinking is required. On the contrary, it is as much and even more indispensable to enable average human beings to attain the mental stature which they are capable of. There have been, and may again be, many individual thinkers in a general atmosphere of mental slavery, but there never has been, nor will be, in that atmosphere, an intellectually active people. And so, again, to keep in mind, Mill was writing these words as part of his classic text titled On Liberty. And very few of you need this reminder, but I know there are some younger folks in the crowd, right? The word liberal does not stand for a particular political party. The essence of the word simply is about trying to engage in free thought. The root of the word is about freedom. And Mill was trying to think about the conditions that were required for having a free populace, a free citizenry. So what can this look like then in the context of education? What do we do as educators to develop this kind of free thought or free thinking? Well, let's go back to the conditions for civil disagreement. Participants must have respect for the rules of reasoning. They must have the willingness to weigh ideas by facts and evidence, and they must have an interest in constructive engagement. So you might think of this as being something kind of like competitive training for citizenry. So first, we would begin by simply teaching students the basic rules and standards of logic itself. So courses in critical thinking, courses in logic are absolutely essential. Now, for an important reason, the liberal arts have an essential role in developing this kind of free thinking. But in particular, we're going to see some disciplines do this better than others. Notice the second step is that you're going to be teaching students how to weigh facts and evidence, how to look at particular studies, how to interpret facts. What should you make in light of the facts with history? Should you look at how they've been shaded by particular studies? And notice this is a group activity. This is the kind of thing that students are engaged in together. We might think of this as being a classroom activity, classroom discussions, this kind of open, engaged project where all the students are working together for a common end. Next, you're going to actually engage. And notice this is where students are going to start to put their skills to the test. They're going to start developing their own views. They're going to start trying them out. They're going to start getting some kickback, literally and figuratively. They're going to start getting a couple bruises here and there because they're going to discover that some of the beliefs they held were false. As Mill says, with civil disagreement and criticism, one has to be willing to follow conclusions wherever logic leads. And so you begin that process, and then of course you come to full combat, right? No hands barred. This is where you actually engage in real civility. This is where you enter into a discussion where you're tracing ideas and you're trying to come to the truth of some conclusion through this joint kind of process. Now, I think philosophy does this better than many or all of the other liberal arts. I realize I'm biased. I am a philosopher. But there's an important project that was started by both Socrates and Plato a long time ago. And you might think of philosophy itself as competitive training for citizenry. Why? Well, it teaches the actual rules of reasoning in logic and critical thinking. It teaches how to weigh arguments by facts and evidence. And it teaches students how to be engaged in a joint critical endeavor, because the entire goal, the entire discipline of philosophy is trying to establish truths for any claim. The questions that are asked, the goals is always to try to seek out the truth for some answer. So Mill says, it is the fashion of the present time to disparage negative logic, that which points out weaknesses in theory or errors in practice without establishing positive truths. Such negative criticism cannot be valued too highly. Until people are again systematically trained to it, there will be few great thinkers and a low general average of intellect. So, this is not overtly a plug for the philosophy department, but John, you can slip me a check after the talk later. For Mill, there is no other way to develop true civility or an informed and engaged citizenry without this kind of explicit, overt training. But not everyone is a student, not everyone goes to college, and after we leave college, we engage in regular political life. So what can be done outside of the context of education? What can we do about civility in regular citizenship? So let's go back to the conditions for civil disagreement again. Notice that they assume motivations. They assume some very particular motivations, the willingness to weigh ideas, an interest in constructive engagement, and respect for the rules of logic. And without those three things, you have this, right, which is the present state of much of our society, and certainly the present state of all of Washington. So what could change motivations? How can you get someone interested in engaging when they're not? How can we try to develop civility? How can we make civility happen? Well, I want to suggest that those are the wrong questions. That's the wrong approach. In fact, I think more than that, I think it's a smokescreen. I think it is a means of redirecting attention and changing the topic of discussion into something else. Notice it redirects it into being someone else's problem. Civility is not something for which I have any personal responsibility. It's not a fault of mine. It's nothing that I engage in. It's someone else's problem. By doing that, it ends up removing personal responsibility. And notice what follows next is that it instantly assumes that civility is someone else's problem. It's that group over there. They're the ones who aren't being civil. And you can go online and just do some quick searches for political cartoons. I love political cartoons. They're so insightful. And you can find on both sides of politics, each side accusing the other of being uncivil, and each side accusing the other of violating free speech, and each side accusing the other of restricting ideas, and each side accusing the other of you name it. So there's several trends in U.S. society that are becoming increasingly prominent. Number one, we're increasingly segregated. So, hey buddy, are you familiar with the term birds of a feather? Right, we see this more and more and more. One of the ways that we see this, you might have heard about this recently, is a book, my mind just went blank on the author, but a book that just came out titled American Nations. And he's a journalist, but he's looking at history of various ideas and areas across the U.S., and he's not the first to come up with this idea. Colin Woodward, that's his name. He's not the first to come up with this idea. There's other folks who've made this kind of argument, but he's been tracking demographic groups as individuals, or as these different groups developed in U.S. history, looking at changes in language, language, looking at religious affiliations, looking at political voting county by county, looking at where groups tend to stay, how families are raised. And his argument is there are really 11 separate nations in the United States, and we should think of them culturally as being 11 different nations. We're also increasingly insulated. I know probably many of you saw this on the news recently. Pew Research Center had a report 64% of adults in the U.S. use Facebook. 30% of those adults consume news on Facebook. Now, this initially sounds a little more dramatic than it is. So what the study shows is that for individuals who go to Facebook, while they're there, they tend to consume some news. It doesn't mean that 30% of all adults go to Facebook for news. But what was more interesting about the Pew study was that there were large differences in the demographics of those Facebook users. So amongst older Facebook users, those individuals tended to seek out news sources in many other places. Among younger Facebook users, namely like many of our students at the universities, they tended not to seek out any other sources for news, and many of them did solely get their news from Facebook alone. This is an increasing trend. So I find this number already alarming. The fact that it's a particularly high number among younger individuals, I think, is particularly even more alarming. We're increasingly insulated from views that would differ from our own. We self-select in many ways what we want to see. And I know many of you probably know this work well by Robert Putnam. So this is simply a chart from his book, Bowling Alone. He's written several books since that time. Robert Putnam is a sociologist who has been tracking declines in social capital and social and political engagement in U.S. society for several decades. And so you can't see the chart. I couldn't blow it up big enough so that you could see it. But the bottom line represents members of some groups who are informed or interested in better government. The second line up, those who served on a committee from some local organization. Third line up, served as an officer of some club or organization. And the fourth is attended a public meeting on town or school affairs. And it starts in 1970 and ends in 1995. Notice that every single one of these points of data that he tracked have declined over time. And so if you haven't read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, I encourage you to. It's a remarkably depressing book. And all of his most recent work, he tries to have a more positive tone. Frankly, it's not much better. But it's a really pervasive pattern. So what do all these general trends mean? What should we make of this? Well, there's a lot of things we could say about this if we were sociologists, which I'm not. I am interested in moral psychology. So thinking about it from that standpoint, I'm looking at these general trends, asking what the implications of this are going to be on our psychology. And the conditions here are simply ripe for stereotyping and labeling. And you might say, well, okay, why does this matter? Well, stereotyping and labeling have powerful psychological effects. And in particular, they have powerful psychological effects on our motivation. So what's wrong with stereotyping? After all, it helps us group things into interesting categories according to particular properties that we see. What's wrong with that? It's a cognitive heuristic of sorts. It enables us to make snap judgments quickly and easily. And as many people say, stereotypes are true for a reason. There are broad pervasive trends. There are statistical points of data. So what's wrong with stereotypes? They exist for a reason. They may not be true in every case, but they certainly exist for a reason. Well, yes. I'll let you read this for a second. They certainly do exist for a reason, right? But what stereotypes tend to do is they pick out the wrong property, and even when they do pick out a property that's relevant, they usually get the causal explanation wrong. So I don't know about you, but I do have a superhero cape, but I don't wear it when I go to the restroom, right? So what's wrong with stereotypes? Well, notice the categorization there is based not primarily on essential features of the group, the defining attributes of a group, but non-essential, oftentimes irrelevant properties. In particular, things that are often false. And typically, the use of stereotypes is to exclude or disparage other members of a group. So this is Gordon Allport's definition of stereotyping from a classic work in 1954 that he wrote called The Nature of Prejudice. And we've got a great case of exclusion, right? This is typically the purposes for which we engage in stereotyping, not to make judgments simpler or easier, but because we've got an underlying motivation. So what's really wrong with stereotyping? Well, notice it abstracts from concrete facts and situations. And because of that, because it tends to group into large categories and pull out properties and features of those large categories which tend to be non-essential, perhaps irrelevant and or false, it depersonalizes from the individuals, and that it's going to be missing the important, relevant, and essential properties. An interesting side effect of this is that it tends to lower empathy, and as a consequence of that, it leads to disparagement and exclusion. So, okay, we might grant that there's something horribly wrong with stereotyping, but what on earth is wrong with labeling? After all, we have to label. We put people in different groups. We have to classify them. Well, there's an interesting phenomenon that social psychologists have known about for quite a long time called the Ingroup Outgroup phenomenon. And you can manipulate subjects quite easily in labs into thinking that they're a member of a group. So, for example, you can bring a subject into a lab to do a test case, and you can give them a little script, a fact about themselves to highlight some feature of them. For example, that they might be born in Washington, or maybe that they have blonde hair, or maybe that they're a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whatever property it is that you like. And then you can have them read a description about their partner in the experiment. And the partner will fall into one of two camps. They will either be a member of the same group, so they perhaps also be from Washington, or also have blonde hair, or they'll be a member of the Outgroup, so they'll be born in New York City, for example. And then the second part of the study is that they enter into an email exchange with their partner. Now, of course, there really is no partner. It's the experimental researchers who are the partners who are studying up various conditions. But the purpose of the study is to evaluate people's perceptions of whether or not their partner is a member of the same group as themselves or a member of a different group from themselves, and what the implication of that is for their own behavior. And what is very surprising is that we tend to see that people make very quick judgments. So if someone is a member of the same group, we view them much more favorably. If they're a member of a different group, we view them much more negatively. And this has powerful implications on our judgments about empathy and helping behavior. So how do they test that? Well, they do it in lots of different ways. One of the simplest ways is part of the study they will also give them a game where they make some money for doing something in particular. And then later in the experimental condition, their partner will let it slip that they lost their wallet, for example, on the bus on the way here, and they would need some bus money to ride home. And then they will test to see how often the subject will volunteer to give their money that they just won for free. It's not like they earned this money in any way. It's a windfall of $5 or whatever it is. And they'll test to see how often they will give that money to their partner in time of need. And they'll vary the circumstance, they'll vary the case, they vary the amount of money. There's all sorts of different experimental conditions. But surprisingly enough, when it is a member of the same group, they very commonly donate the money and help. If it's a member of a different group, the outgroup, they don't. So let's go back to the conditions for civil disagreement and this problem we have about how civility requires particular motivations, and it's the motivations themselves that we're missing, right? We don't have willingness, we don't have interest, we don't have respect, we don't know how to get that. How do you make that happen? Again, I'm going to suggest that's the wrong question. Notice you can't make motivations happen. They're not the kind of thing that you can make a decision about. You can't decide to be motivated. It doesn't work that way. Our psychology is not wired in that way. And notice, these kinds of problems with stereotyping and labeling often operate under the level of conscious awareness. So it's not, again, the kind of thing that you could make a decision about. So what do we do? What's the prescription that we should offer, given that in our society we see very little civility, we see overt cases of no respect, willingness, or even interest to engage? What's the prescription? Well, we shouldn't give up stereotyping and labeling and hate everyone individually. That's not the goal here, right? You see why I love political cartoons. They're just priceless. So stop prejudice, treat everyone equally, just hate everyone as individuals. That's not the goal here. What is it? Well, the prescription I propose is that it's through action and it's through engagement with others. And this should not be a surprise to any of you in this room. You know this already, right? But it's not simply having any kind of engagement. It's only engagement of a particular sort. It must be direct personal experience. And so this photograph I just simply love. And I didn't include this so that we could critique their lifting technique. I do think their lifting technique is quite good, actually. But notice we've got a mixture here of lots of different kinds of individuals. We have some middle-aged folks. We have some young college students wearing their fraternity outfits. We've got black, we've got white. We've even got a fellow way on the far side who is supervising of some sort. What's so nice about this kind of project that Habitat for Humanity does, and many other kinds of civic engagement projects, is that you work directly with individuals and you get to know them as individuals. You get to know those personal details about them. They're not seen as individuals, as members of a group. They have names, they have stories, and you learn those facts and stories about them. So I cannot remember this woman's name, but she was one of the residents, or one of the individuals for whom they were building a house, and she was there working alongside the volunteers at Habitat for Humanity to have her house built. And so the people, of course, usually get to meet the family members that they're making the house for. So why would direct personal experience matter so much? Well, we're going to go back to Allport. He had a hypothesis, which is that stereotypes do not subside unless there is contact. He called it his contact hypothesis. They don't subside unless there is contact with 3 or more members of the stereotyped group. Now, subsequent research has developed that, and 3 may not be the precise number. But why did he think it was that? Well, notice if you simply run into one case, it's easy to disconfirm it as a random odd occurrence. If you run into 2 cases, you have to stop and think about this a little bit more. You run into 3 cases, you start to question maybe you attributed something falsely to this group. There's a really fascinating project at Harvard now that's being done on Project Implicit, and you can go online. Harvard has this fantastic website, and you can look up all the studies that they are doing about various forms of implicit bias. Now, they're not actually proposing that many solutions for implicit bias and stereotyping, but one of the things that they do offer as a prescription, and it's not a different prescription than anything that philosophers from early theories of mind have offered for a long time, is that we need to change the associations of our ideas. And how do we do that? We do that by additional experience, which alters the categories that we form and the assumptions that we make. So Harvard's doing some really fantastic research on that. I encourage you to look it up. So let's go back to our motivations then. How can we get willingness and interest and respect? Well, how can we create motivation? Well, one of the interesting things is notice by simply engaging with others and seeing them as individuals, one of the interesting effects of that is that our motivations tend to change, because it tends to destroy the stereotypes and it tends to destroy some of the labeling that minimizes the motivations that we have. And so you might think of civility actually as not being the goal, but civility as being almost a side condition or a byproduct of having particular kinds of motivations. We might think of these crucial motivations as willingness, interest, and respect as being the bedrock conditions that are truly necessary for civility, and then what comes next as the conditions for actual disagreement and how disagreement could occur in a positive framework. So I love this classic poster that you see at a union rally, right, outside of a state house. You can see it in the background. What do we want? Respectful discourse. When do we want it? And usually the phrase is, no. But of course they say, well, now would be agreeable to me, but I'm interested in your opinion, right? This really captures the essence of what we're after here, which is that change in motivation, that actual interest in engaging, not in simply making demands, not in simply placing restrictions on the discourse, not demanding the conditions for the debate, but true engagement. So Thomas Jefferson has this fantastic quote, and I think it really captures the essence of how we should think about civility and also how we should think about these developing motivations that we have or fail to have. A nation as a society forms a moral person, a single unit, a moral person. And every member of it is personally responsible for his society. And so we might think about the fact that each one of us is a single point in part of a larger picture. And it's the kind of engagement that we have on a day-to-day basis. It's the kind of engagement that we have with our friends, with our peers, with our neighbors, with people at PTA, with organizations such as this, that matters so much for creating not the conditions for civility, civility is the byproduct, but actually the motivations that drive civility itself. Thank you. So are there any questions?
If you would please come up to the microphones, that would be great. That way everybody can hear.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, very insightful talk. I teach Mill every year myself, and one thing that Mill is willing to accept that I didn't really hear in your talk is Mill understands that liberty and democracy are not easy. It takes a lot of work, and people are not really free not to do it. He argues in on representative government, for instance, that people need to be forced to vote. There needs to be compulsory voting. If you don't vote, you're fine. I would argue it should be open voting, not secret.
That's a 100-year-old American tradition. But that for Mill, voting in public would require you to be open to objection and so forth. But let me ask you a little different. I'm not really interested in compulsory voting, but the engagement you talk about, what would you think about compulsory engagement, like compulsory service? Habitat for Humanity is nice. It's a wonderful thing. Most people don't do it. What if every citizen, as does happen in some countries, are required after 18 or after college to take a year of compulsory service? Could be military, could be something else. What would you think about that?
Good. That's nice. So I want to temper my comments with a caveat first, which is that I'm not a social and political philosopher. So you're now beyond the bounds of my expertise. So now this is me as a private citizen speaking. My own thought on that is I don't see a particular problem with the notion of compulsory activities for the good of development. But it's got that important caveat at the end, right? I jokingly say to my students, and this is a joke, please don't quote me anywhere, I don't want this online. I jokingly say to my students that nobody should vote unless they have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, right? And all the philosophy students are like, yeah, and the non-philosophy students look very puzzled, right? Why is that? Because it teaches that kind of reasoning skill that I think is absolutely essential for engaged informed voting. You cannot be an informed voter without it, without those skills of reasoning. And so in a certain measure, you might simply equate what you're suggesting as any kind of educational training necessary to achieve any kind of certification, right? So we make students who want to get a driving license go through some sort of driving training. So there are some things that are compulsory in the sense that if you want what comes at the end of it, you've got to go through some hoops to get there. But that's me speaking as a personal individual. I'm not a social and political philosopher.
Thank you for speaking.
Thank you.
Apparently what we're doing now isn't working because I think there's a lot more forces that drive us apart than drive us together. And I think that if you go to a coffee shop, you'll find birds of a feather drinking together. And they'll be discussing the same political outlook and agreeing with one another wholeheartedly, generally on one side of the spectrum or the other. And we have radio and television that are driving us apart with their opinion. And the facts don't seem to be facts anymore. They seem to be laid out in such a way that there are value statements. And so I'm just looking at if your approach is to come at it one person at a time with deep dialogue, it seems like there's many forces that will keep that from happening.
Absolutely.
Wondering what the real solution is if that's a weak force amongst a lot of great forces.
Good. So I have to say, despite the attempt to give an optimistic end to the talk, I think it's a rather bleak and dark future. Because I don't think, Andrew's laughing at me, it is a bleak and dark future. I don't think that civility is the kind of thing that can be foisted on society whole scale. We got into this mess slowly. And we got into this mess because of broad historical, social, and political changes. And we're not going to get out of it quickly either. We can have as many people advocating for civility from Washington as we'd like. We can have Chairman Jim Leach going on civility tours. And if all that we're doing with civility is making posters and putting signs up and telling people they should be civil, then that's not the essence of the problem. That's why, speaking as a moral psychologist, I think we have to look deeper into the attitudes and motivations that we have towards our fellow citizens. And how do you recreate those? Well, you can't foist them on anyone. And so it isn't as though I think there is no hope for us. I think that there is long term. I don't think that it's anything immediate. Certainly nothing within the next 10 years, and that bodes very poorly for our democracy. Now, with that said, I think that the kind of work that's being done here at the Hauenstein Center is crucial for reversing that kind of project. I also think the kind of work that's done at universities all across the country is crucial for reversing that project. And what I think is important is for faculty members, in philosophy in particular, but across the liberal arts, to start thinking in a more purposive way, even in general education courses too, to be thinking in a more purposive way about how it is that we teach civility. And so university presidents, boards of trustees, faculty senates need to start talking about civility and modeling it in their classrooms, because civility is the kind of thing that not just requires particular statements, but it requires practice, it requires training. So there is hope for the future, I think, but it's going to be slow. It comes with education. And one of the really interesting things, and I think a really good insight that Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist that I referred to, pointed out, which is that we've had a broad-scale social disengagement for about 4 decades now. That's not something we can reverse quickly. And it's not just a loss of civility, it's a loss of engagement in all public life. And so there are deeper problems to be addressed here. Civility is one of them. But how do you go about trying to reinstill that kind of interest? That's beyond the bounds of this talk, but my suspicion is that it has to do with the loss of respect. So you're not too interested in going to PTA meetings and having to deal with those people of that group who say those things if you've got no respect for them. And if you don't see any goal of your project as leading to any kind of benefit for the good of all. So that's, I guess, the real reason why education matters so very, very much. Long-winded way of saying there is hope for the future, in the distant future. Yes, please.
I'm a nonprofit organization director working in Nepal, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's just been through a civil war. It's spent the last 7-8 years trying to forge out its own democracy. So from a historical point of view, this is all exciting to me. Mm. And one of the things our organization is involved in is taking disadvantaged children in a country that is overwhelmingly caste-based. Mm. And taking these children, or I should say the education model throughout the Third World is simply rote learning. Not much different from where it was in the 18th century in America or in the world. And what we have done is bring, and Nepal has something like 100 different languages and ethnic groups. And so it's immensely diverse. And so we have developed an environment of inclusiveness among these disadvantaged students. And one of their educational techniques, since we don't dare try to change the educational system of an entire country, but just of prospective leaders among our kids, is to show socially meaningful movies and have open discussions. Now, this is something that just does not occur within the classroom. It's something that used to occur in our classrooms, and maybe in some classrooms still does. And then from the primary and secondary school level, we take them into college, and they have another club in which they now invite speakers in. And they have this dialogue with speakers, question and answers. Now, I'll give you a few examples. These children are extremely innocent. Okay? And one of our speakers was transgender. And it was quite an eye-opening for many of these kids. You know, it wasn't shock. It was just like, how come nobody ever told me? And after the question and answer session, they mobbed the person and wanted to know more and more. And platforms like this have just been just so overwhelmingly successful. And I think we go back to it. I think there's not enough inclusiveness in discussion of diversity and so forth. The birds of the feathers are all the same. And we've segregated ourselves. I remember one event, my German class in high school, the Frau, this was post-World War II, and she came over here and taught German, and one of the things she said about Nazi Germany was political discussion became stifled when Hitler controlled the Ratskellers, where open discussion occurred in the brew houses underneath the civil halls. So I want to cut it off here, but I just wanted to throw this out as it may be bleak here, but throughout the third world, throughout the rest of the world, democracy is happening. Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that that's a good example of the kind of educational process that matters so much. One of the things that a lot of individuals in the liberal arts do will be to focus conversation around a classic text a classic film, a classic piece of philosophy, a social case, a bit of history, and then discuss it from a variety of angles. And there's lots of really interesting models for how this can be developed in U.S. society too. So several members from GVSU's philosophy department and I are going to be going to a conference called the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics in 2 weeks. And what is interesting about that conference is they have something called the National Ethics Bowl. And much like political science model league competitions, the Ethics Bowl puts together teams, not of philosophers, but of students from a variety of disciplines. And they are given cases taken from the headlines, real, actual cases from life, those thorny, prickly, messy ones that we all squabble and fight about. And they're given those cases, and they have to develop arguments for them in teams. This is a competition. It's like a debate-style competition. But they're not judged or evaluated according to their sophistry. Rather, they're evaluated according to how well they can construct an argument, who develops the best kinds of points, who brings in the best kind of evidence, who responds best to the questions from the other side, attending to the process of discussion. It's a really fantastic model. So it's done on a regional level, and then there's a national competition as well, and several of us are going to be judges at the national competition. So there are these kinds of interactive processes that go on in classrooms, they go on in nonprofits, and that's exactly the way of the future. It's that kind of engagement. Thank you.
You've mentioned how we can work toward a greater level of civility through engagement with people who are different from us in a higher education platform, as well as possibly through some sort of compulsory service. Can you think of any other ways how you could engage individuals who don't necessarily fit into one of those categories, or in the event that compulsory service wasn't an option?
Good. Yeah, so let me take compulsory service off the table. That's me as a private citizen. So notice, I think there are lots of ways that this can happen, and this happens in all sorts of social and civic organizations we already have. So we have one of the things that Putnam points out in his work, this is why he titles it Bowling Alone, is that we used to have all kinds of bowling leagues, and then bowling was very popular, and then it died. We used to have all kinds of card-playing leagues. We used to get together and play bridge. We used to get together for family picnics and outings. PTA used to be a huge organization. There are all kinds of social organizations in every city, in every town, in every rural community. Granges, for example. Participation in all of them has dropped away. So how do you do this in the context outside of education? That's precisely it. You go start being engaged in those kinds of civic institutions and organizations that we already have in place. The trouble is we haven't been doing it. And so because of that, we've got these trends of being increasingly isolated and distanced. The prescription here is to start doing it again and to engage in that personal, direct experience. Actually getting to know someone from the other side of the aisle and getting to know their wife's name or their husband's name and their dog's name and their kids, and maybe having a picnic with them. That kind of event matters more than we would have ever thought. It matters not just for social capital, but it also matters for the psychological effect it has on us in our judgments and interactions of others. So that's how.
I really appreciate that comment that you just made about how much that matters, that kind of interaction. And so for me, one of the challenges that I see is that service learning opportunities or volunteering or all the different kinds of things that we can do are really critical for developing these civil discourse kinds of skills that you're talking about. But I really wonder how far we can go as long as we have residential segregation. So the interactions we have at that picnic are defined by the people attending that picnic, right? And who our neighbors are, and the people with whom we spend, our daily lives, those little minutes that don't, show up big. Really define for us what we know, and that impacts what we care about. What we care about motivates what we do. So I was wondering if you could speak for a moment about any connections you might see between the history of residential segregation, and I think I mean specifically racially and socioeconomically, and this idea of civility in the ways that you've described it.
Good. So that's a great question, because certainly there are limits to this notion of Allport's contact hypothesis, right? And as we know from our own history, it isn't as though we had glory days in the past where all was golden and wonderful. We had really really upsetting racial segregation and political fights and disputes, and it isn't as though that's an era to which we should return. One of the things I can say is that Youngstown, Ohio has, like any city, areas that are really racially divided. And so what do you do in cases where you have living conditions where whole swaths of people are separated? The reason I brought Youngstown up is it is the most unusual and wonderful place I've lived ever, I think. Youngstown is unique in being a steel town. They brought in large numbers of ethnic groups to work in steel factories. And as the immigrants came in, they tended to settle in their own communities. And so they tended to focus in small groups. They had their own churches. They had their own festivals. And a lot of that has continued and still today. There are regions that up until, I believe, the 70s still had on the books that groups like blacks or Jews or Italians were not allowed to move into the neighborhood. So when you're talking about residential segregation, it is certainly a very real problem, and it's not that far distant for it being on the books, and it certainly is still a reality today. So what do you do about that? Well, I certainly don't think that civility is going to solve those problems. But one of the interesting things is that we're members of lots of different groups. And being members of lots of different groups, we span lots of different categories. So it used to be the case, a bit more, that you could find someone who is black and Republican and Christian, or black and Republican or atheist, or white and Republican or Christian, or white and Democrat and atheist, or figure out whatever mix you like of all those groups. But we have become increasingly segregated, not just how we live in our ethnic groups or our racial groups, but with our views themselves. And so part of this, I think, is because we have fewer racial groups, we're going to have more overlaps of other categories if we simply start engaging in more social institutions again. So for example, suppose you do go to something like the PTA. In Youngstown, Ohio, I think the average percentage of the city population is something like 70% African American. So if you were to go to a PTA meeting there, you're going to have a very different demographic. But you're not just going to run into African American individuals, you're also going to run into people who are Catholics, people who are Methodists, and it's those other categories, I think, that are going to make more of a difference. Combating the overall problem of housing inequality is a huge and monumental problem. And civility won't solve those problems. But thank you.
One last question. Two last questions. We're having a race to the microphone.
You're both very special. So the check is coming in the mail, right, John?
It is.
He's the chair of the Department of
signed.
Philosophy.
Thank you. I have a question. You describe it as if when people got engaged in sort of civic activities, say, as if they were going to make society better, right? And you posed it, though, as a question about motivation. And I wondered if part of the trouble isn't more a view of the self that might be behind some of that. That is, it seems like, say, for Mill, a big part of it is that you're developing yourself. You're going to make yourself better, which is pretty striking coming from Mill, who's a genius to start, right? But the thought is that you're going to improve your judgment. You're going to get better yourself. And I wonder if part of the trouble is that people don't see that. In fact, they have a different view of the self, a sort of authenticity idea that they don't really want to change themselves. In fact, they're supposed to sort of emote just the way they are, and they don't particularly want to be changed. Does that inhibit it, or is that part of it?
So I think this is where Robert Putnam's work is really fascinating again. He offers, as a political scientist, he's tracking all kinds of trends, and he's trying to figure out what has led to some of the declines that we've seen. One of the things that he points to is a generational difference. So you could think of all the different generational groups that we've had, right? Gen X, Gen Y. I don't even know what the current generation is now. I lose track. I don't even know what I am, frankly. But each of these different generations do have different views, as you point out, of the self, of their goals. They have different strategies for dealing with others. This newest generation that just hit college campuses this year, the name of which I can't remember, is a very different group of students who tend to have parents who hover quite a lot. And the students have a lot of challenges in knowing how to negotiate their own problems. And believe me, I'm seeing this in the classroom. I even had a parent call one day to castigate me for something that, her son hadn't done, and I thought, did I wake up and start teaching at a high school? I was flabbergasted. The parent would call me. So you're right that there are generational differences. These generational differences carry with them beliefs and attitudes and motivations. But that's not the whole of the story, and there's good sociological evidence to back that up. And I can't recall the precise pie chart that Putnam gives us, but I think it's something like 24% that he attributes to intergenerational changes. What I think is more interesting about Mill is that Mill doesn't see these projects as being disconnected. So it is about developing the self, and it's about developing one's own rationality. It's about developing one's own ideas. It's about understanding the ground for one's own ideas. But he also understands that that process not only can't occur unless it's done, in Peggy's phrase, in concert with others, but it's also something that is inherently good for society itself. And he makes all kinds of arguments, which I didn't go through this evening, about how no opinion can or should ever be stifled because it actually leads to a decline in human progress. So his ultimate goal here, as a utilitarian, this is no surprise, his ultimate goal here is to develop the greatest good for all of society. The good of the individual is certainly part of that. And so I think that's how we should think about this, which is that in developing our own motivations, we're simultaneously doing two things. We're developing ourselves and our own capacity to engage in others and to engage civilly, but simultaneously, and this is why I ended with the Island of the Grand Jeté by Surratt, we have to think of ourselves as being as individual points in a larger picture. And together we're all making up that dynamic. And so there really is no such thing as simply developing one's own self. Tori, you get the final question.
Thank you for everything today and tonight. My question is, I'm wondering what it's like to be in one of your classes, and specifically talking about civility and learning about it. And do you have exercises that you have your students do, or are there things that you have them practice to learn how to engage in civil disagreement?
Good. So unfortunately, this is going to be posted online, and then my students can go watch this and get all the tips and tricks. So I'm like letting the cat out of the bag here, Tori. Way to go. So one of the things that I do really explicitly in the classroom is I try to get students to objectify ideas. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but one of the fastest and quickest ways to try to minimize anger and heated disputes is to get ideas up on the board, or to get ideas on paper, and then to get students to treat it as an object, not as a belief that they hold or someone else in the room holds, to which they're horribly offended when that other person says this idea, but to treat it as itself a thing. And that kind of process is remarkable in how it can bring down a level of anger and the level of sort of heated discussion. So that's the first thing, is in every single class, there's a strong emphasis, every idea is put up on the board, and then we evaluate it. And I jokingly channel positions, right? So I will become famous philosophers, or I will become, the antithesis of whatever theorist that we're talking about that day. I'll do my best to channel that person. The students find this enormously funny, right? But one of the things that I think is important in doing so is it teaches students the value of being able to adopt ideas from the other side, and to not make a straw man argument out of it, not to develop a position that's weak and is actually a caricature, but to develop the position quite forcefully, to develop the best argument, the best evidence that you can for it. And so by seeing me model that for the students, and then by engaging in a collective discussion about the ideas, and then another one will pull up an idea, and then another one will say, yes, but, and then someone else will say, yeah, but somebody could say, right? And then they start engaging in this. And this is nothing that happens quickly. This is something that emerges over the course of a semester with non-philosophy students. Now, philosophy students, we already got our foot in the door on those ones, right? We've been working on them, teaching them logic, teaching them critical thinking, teaching them how to evaluate arguments. So it's a different kind of process for those students. There, we go at them with full combat. But that's the kind of project that I try to engage students in. And it's really teaching them not only through overt training. I teach them argument forms. I teach them fallacies of arguments. I try to teach them how to analyze their own assumptions behind arguments they're making, to try to interpret facts from different standpoints as well. And I sometimes also engage in debates in the classroom too. And I have them pick, guess what? The position they disagree with, and they have to argue from that side. What is remarkable about that kind of project is that almost invariably, at the end of the class period, students who were violently opposed to one position now think it isn't crazy. And that's the goal, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience.
Well, tonight, Professor Mower, we have been your classroom, and I really appreciate all the ways that you have deepened and enriched our discourse on this campus and in this community as we strive in our Common Ground initiative to bring people who have widely divergent opinions together in an effort to find some common ground. So thank you for being our professor, our teacher tonight. And no evening, I have to step right over here. No evening is complete when we've had a speaker. Let's go ahead and stand out here in the middle.
Oh, goodness.
If you don't get a Ralph Hauenstein swag bag, so let's give it to her and thank her once again. Well, welcome. Please gather. We are going to have a wonderful evening of civility. So turn to your neighbor and make sure you say hi and do show good manners. But as you know, civility is a lot more than good manners if you've read our speaker's work. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm proud to serve as the director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University. And I love events like this because they really represent a lot of support from other people in the community and from other departments at the university. Let me start with our donor base, which has been wonderfully generous in helping make programs like this possible. I want to point out that Ralph Hauenstein in 5 weeks is going to be 102 years old. I think he deserves a hand. And we could not do these programs without Ralph and so many other generous people that make them possible. I want to give a shout out to Hillary Snell on our advisory cabinet at the Hauenstein Center. And also, it's colleagues here at Grand Valley that have made a very wonderful environment in which to pursue common ground and civil discourse. A shout out to our dean at the Brooks College, Ann Hiskus. Ann, thank you for all the work you're doing. Marlene Kowalski-Brown in the back, thank you for the work you're doing. Let's give them a hand. We have leadership from our Board of Trustees here at Grand Valley. For example, Noreen Myers up here in the front row. Noreen, please raise your hand and be acknowledged. We appreciate all you've done. Thank you. So it's my privilege to kick off this evening, and I want to bring up a colleague. The philosophy department has also been instrumental in helping make this event possible. They're having further events tomorrow. We're very happy. The chair of the department, Professor Uliata, has been supportive. We also have Peggy Vandenberg from the department, and she's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Please welcome Peggy Vandenberg.
Hi. William James, a famous American pragmatist philosopher, complained that philosophy bakes no bread. Some of my students complain about the same thing. Why do we study philosophy? But there's a wave of young philosophers who are using their logical skills and their erudite and meticulous questioning to make a real difference, not just on what we can know as true or false, but in how we might proceed to use that knowledge and to understand each other, and the world we live in, and the world we create with our endeavors, and in our relationships with others. Deborah Mower is one of those philosophers who cross disciplines, and when the inquiry demands it, and collaborates with other scholars when putting our knowledge together, gives us a better insight and awareness. There have always been philosophers who wanted to make a real difference in the world, but this new breed do not work in isolated chambers like Descartes. When Deborah set out to work on the issue of civility, she gathered scholars for a conference, and then she picked the best of them to write the chapters in her recent book on civility. From this project and Deborah's work in moral psychology, her studies in Confucianism, moral education, and her latest book, Developing Moral Sensitivity, and another collaborative project of which I am a part, Deborah is making a difference. Deborah is from the West Coast, raised in Washington State, and began her education at Pacific University. Then moving to the University of Wisconsin, where she earned her master's and doctorate in philosophy. Her publications make connections between various disciplines, sociology, psychology, and philosophy, on topics such as education, virtue ethics, practical ethics, sex differences in morality, moral reasoning, sympathy, situationism, and Confucianism. So I am pleased to introduce to you tonight Dr. Deborah Mower, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion at Youngstown State University. Welcome, Deborah.